WHGE 95.3 FM. Coming up, the Open Eye.
Those of us that indulge in or commit intellectual violence don't do so for the pleasure of mental masturbation or ego diddling. We do so because the chains of oppression on our people's minds are deep and difficult to remove.
Good morning, my children of the sun. Welcome to the Open Eye on WHGE 95.3 FM. I'm your host, Third Eye Optometrist, Patrice Gibbs, here to get that eye open. Yes, I am. And as we always start, every generation has its purpose. Ours is to reveal the truth and reverse the brainwashing. All right. Let me start here, right? Because today we are living through a time when truth is treated like contraband. History is rewritten in real time. The victims of oppression are told to be quiet, while the architects of oppression demand comfort, patience, and understanding. But some of us were not born to forget. Some of us carry memory like fire. And understand this clearly. Memory is dangerous in a society built on selective amnesia. Because once you remember who profited from slavery, who defended segregation, who gutted voting rights, who criminalized black existence while wrapping themselves in the language of freedom, then suddenly the political theater of America stops looking confusing. It starts looking familiar. You begin to see the straight line from the plantation to the convict lease system to redlining to mass incarceration, to voter suppression to the modern tactics on the modern attacks on black history, black political power, and black identity itself. That line is not broken. It evolved. And every generation has to decide whether they will confront it or become servants to it. See, too many people want unity without truth. They want reconciliation without accountability. They want black people to endlessly forgive what this nation refuses to even honestly acknowledge. No. Truth first. Always truth first. In the day as laws are rewritten, books are banned, districts are redrawn, protest is criminalized, and black voices are targeted yet again, some of us are done pretending we don't understand exactly what we are witnessing. This is not confusion. This is not a misunderstanding. This is power protecting itself. And while some people are desperate to assimilate in the systems that have historically consumed us, others have chosen another path entirely. A path rooted in memory, a path rooted in dignity, a path rooted in African consciousness and responsibility. And as one declaration states, I am one of those truly committed, unconquerable warriors who remembers more and more about who we uncompromisingly, naturally are. fully understands the concepts of enemy and traitor and has absolutely no desire to be anything less than African. Now understand something before people deliberately twist those words. To know the difference between an enemy and a traitor is not hatred, it's survival. Don't get it mixed. Every people on earth understand this except black people in America, because we have been conditioned to confuse awareness with extremism, self-defense with aggression, and self-respect with division. But every liberation struggle in history required people who refused compromise with oppression. Every single one. Harriet Tubman understood it. Malcolm understood it. The Mau Mau understood it. The ANC understood it before respectability politics softened the edges of the revolution and the symbolism. Who benefits when black people forget? Who profits when we stop teaching history? Who gains when we fear our own identity more than we fear our oppression? That's what Open Eye is about. Not comfort, not performance, not empty patriotism, clarity. Because once you truly see, you cannot unsee. And once the people remember who they are, history changes. Let's get to work. Hey, what's up, man? Hey, I see you there, Steve. All right, let me get my disclaimer out the way. We're going to get it going.
The views and opinions expressed on Open Eye are those of the hosts, guests, and contributors, and do not reflect the policy or position of WHGE 95.3 FM, nor our sponsor, the Delaware Center for Homeless Vets. Any content provided by Open Eye's hosts, guests, or contributors are theirs and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, company, or individual.
All right. Let's start here. The architects of time. All right. You know, there's a specific kind of silence that happens when truth meets arrogance. It's the silence behind is that so face. You know, the look we make when younger branches of the human family try to lecture us about the foundations of society. As if the world was a void until they arrived. The history is not a story of Western discovery. It is a story of African foundation. We are told that philosophy began in Greece, but check the receipts. Pythagoras and Plato didn't find wisdom in the caves of Europe. They found it in the temples of the Nile. They were the students, Africa was the professor. By the time Europe was a collection of warring clans, African civilizations had already mastered celestial precision. They weren't just looking at the stars. They were calculating them into the architecture of the pyramids. They were practicing advanced medicine, performing complex surgery, and documenting remedies. While the rest of the world was still centuries away from basic hygiene. Africa did not stand outside the gates of civilization begging for an invitation. Africa built the first gates. And then came the great forgetting. They called them the Dark Ages for a reason. Europe was in a literal and intellectual blackout, and it was Africa that turned the lights back on. In the 8th century, the Moors crossed the straits and brought with them the mistake of civilizing the West. They brought street lights to Cordoba while London was a mud pit. They brought algebra, chemistry, and the very concept of the public library. Africa gave Europe the tools to end its own ignorance. Excuse me. But look at the exchange rate. When Africa expanded, it exported refinement. It brought irrigation to dry lands and systems of consensus to chaotic societies. African democracy wasn't a ballot box for the few. It was a tradition of councils, elders, and community-driven law that prioritized the collective over the individual. Yet, when the civilized world turned its gaze back toward Africa, they didn't bring medicine. They brought microbeams. They didn't bring philosophy. They brought chains. They didn't bring trade. They brought extradition. They brought extraction. The tragedy isn't that the history is missing. The tragedy is that the world was molded to ignore it. Colonization isn't just the theft of land, it is the theft of the timeline. It's the audacity to tell the architect that they are merely a guest in the house that they built. So when people speak with the unearned authority of a teacher bringing civilization to a dark continent, remember, Africa was never lost. The world just spent centuries trying to hide the map. We aren't reclaiming history. We're simply stopping the lie. Africa is not the student of civilization. Africa is the author. This is Dove and I. Hey, Sherry, I see you there, sister. All right. Okay. Bill Street. Yeah. They tell you Bill Street was saved. They point to the $5 million renovation in the 80s and the millions of tourists who flock there now. But you can't save a body by taxiderming its skin after you cut out his heart. To understand the fall of Bill, you have to understand that it didn't just crumble. It was dismantled with surgical precision and racial intent. Let's talk about the slum clearance myth. In the 1950s and 60s, city planners looked at Bill Street, a place where black people owned the banks, the clubs, and the future, and they didn't see a miracle of resilience. They saw a threat. By labeling these blocks as blighted, the white establishment used the law to do what the lynch mob couldn't. They broke the back of black economic independence. The policy was called urban renewal, but on the ground it was state-sponsored displacement. This is the valuation trap. Properties in black districts were systematically undervalued by white appraisers. When the city moved in with eminent domain, they paid black owners pennies on the dollar, ensuring they could never afford to rebuild elsewhere. See, it's the erasure of the ecosystem. Because a business isn't just a sign on a door. It's a web of credit, foot traffic, and community trust. When the Memphis Housing Authority leveled hundreds of buildings, they didn't just move people, they vaporized the multi-generational wealth building machine. Think about the math of that loss. When a black doctor or a club owner was forced out, they didn't just lose a building. They lost their customer base, their collateral, and their legacy. The economic damage wasn't side effect, it was the point. See, by the mid-70s, Beale Street was a graveyard of empty lots. Not because the music died, but because the city pulled the plug on the people who played it. Today's Beale is a managed experience. It's profitable, sure. But look at the D. Most of those neon-lit clubs are owned by the families who survived the Jim Crow era. They are leases held by corporations in a district managed by the city. The fall of Beale Street wasn't a tragedy of changing times. It was a heist. It was the deliberate destruction of a black middle class under the guise of cleaning up the city. So when you walk those 3 blocks today, don't just listen to the blues coming from the speakers. Listen for the silence of the businesses that should still be there. Listen for the wealth that was stolen. Oh, the lights are back on, but the people who lit them are gone. Okay? Let's look deeper. Because people hear Beale Street and think music. But before it was entertainment, it was economics. That's right, economics. What made Beale Street powerful was not just the blues. It was the black economy surrounding the blues. See, black America once understood something we had spent generations being disconnected from. A community becomes powerful when its money circulates within the community. Beale Street was what economists today will call a loop economy. And black workers earned money from black businesses. Black businesses hired black employees. Black professionals served black families. Black newspapers advertised black-owned stores. Black doctors treated black patients. Black banks financed black dreams. Black musicians played in black-owned clubs for black audiences, spending black dollars. The dollar moved in circles. It was a loop. Not for minutes, not for hours, sometimes for days before it left the community. And that circulation creates strength. One black-owned restaurant buys bread from a black baker. The baker buys suits from a black tailor. The tailor banks with a black-owned bank. The bank finances a black pharmacist. The pharmacist advertises in a black newspaper. The newspaper hires black writers and printers. That is how a community rises. And Beale Street had it all. You had the legendary Robert R. Church Sr., one of the South's first black millionaires, a man born enslaved who built an empire in Memphis through real estate, banking, and business ownership. And hear that clearly, carefully. A former enslaved black man became one of the most powerful businessmen in the South during the age of Jim Crow. That alone tells you how extraordinary Beale Street really was. Church built businesses, purchased property, and helped finance black enterprise when white institutions either excluded black people or exploited them. He understood something many people still don't understand today. Ownership changes the conversation. You also had institutions like black-owned insurance companies, black-owned funeral homes, black physicians and dentists, black hotels and boarding houses, black saloons and music venues, black newspapers like the Memphis Free Speech founded by Ida B. Wells before white mobs violence destroyed its offices. And understand this. These businesses were not surviving because white America suddenly became fair. No. They survived because segregation forced black people to rely on each other. That's the contradiction of segregation. It was evil. But in resisting that evil, black communities developed internal ecosystems. Black teachers taught black children. Black contractors built black neighborhoods. Black farmers sold to black markets. Black barbers, black beauty shops, black pharmacists, black undertakers, black insurance agents. Entire economic networks existed. And Beale Street became one of the beating hearts of that system. That's why it mattered so much. Not because it entertained America, because it demonstrated black capacity. It proved black people could organize wealth, culture, education, and commerce under some of the harshest racial conditions imaginable. And once black economic concentration becomes visible in America, history shows us what often follows. Surveillance, disruption, displacement, disinvestment. Because economic independence creates political independence. A population that owns businesses, lands, banks, and institutions becomes harder to control. That's why urban renewal hit black communities like a bomb. Yeah, the Poplar Street A project. I hear you, Steve. People think the destruction of these neighborhoods was only physical. No. The real destruction was economic circulation. When you break the loop, the community weakens. Now the worker earns money somewhere else, spends it somewhere else, banks somewhere else, invests somewhere else, and eventually the neighborhood becomes dependent instead of self-sustaining. That's what was lost on Beale Street. Not just buildings, not just clubs, an economic system. And here's the tragedy. America still profits from the culture created there, while many descendants of the people who built it remain economically marginalized. The music became global. Yeah, the wealth did not. That's the part they don't want put on travel brochures. This is the open eye. Today's lesson is simple. Culture without economic control is performance. Real power is ownership. Real freedom is circulation. Real independence is where your community can feed, hire, finance, educate, and sustain itself. Beale Street once understood that. The question is, do we still? WHGE 95.3 FM. All right. WHGE 95.3 FM, the open eye. So, what do we do about it? All right? Because they're coming. All right? Hey, Rhonda. I tell you what, the call is going out. The Southeastern Conference should be boycotted. In response to gutting and voting rights amendment, SEC universities support Republican politicians who have stripped away voting districts that predominantly serve black voters while making billions in revenue from black athletes. 56% of all black Americans live in Confederate states. And as such, they deserve political representation. We are calling on all football, basketball, track and field, and other athletic programs to participate in this SEC athletics boycott. A weekly boycott of all nationally televised SEC games. Our current black athletes to transfer from SEC schools, and for athletes to decommit from all SEC schools. Southern Eastern Conference. Voting rights and representation are the most fundamental rights for all Americans, and black voters deserve the same rights as any other American. And these Southeastern Conference schools are Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, LSU, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Missouri, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas A&M, Vanderbilt. Our athletes, our voices, our vote, our future. Boycott, transfer, decommit. God damn it, demand justice. I had a question. What kind of nefarious psychopath studies the survival mechanisms of an oppressed people, learns how they stayed alive under terror, and then turns around and attacks the very consciousness that kept them breathing? What kind of bastard is that? That's not scholarship. That's reconnaissance. You don't spend years studying enslaved Africans, preserving family, language, spirituality, memory, resistance, coded communication, mutual aid, and collective awareness under one of the most violent systems in human history, and then pretend you don't understand what stay woke means. You know exactly what it means. Woke was never about being trendy. It was never about hashtags, never about corporate slogans, never about politicians near-name kente cloth. Woke meant pay attention. Watch your surroundings. Know who means you harm. Recognize propaganda. Recognize danger. Recognize betrayal. And recognize systems designed to destroy you while pretending to protect you. Stay awake. Stay alert. Stay alive. That phrase came out of a people who had to survive slave patrols, lynch mobs, Jim Crow sheriffs, redlining, COINTELPRO, medical experimentation, voter suppression, police violence, and educational sabotage. Black awareness is not an academic exercise. It was survival intelligence. And Kevin Roberts knows it. That's the disturbing part. This is a man who studied African American history, studied slavery, studied black family survival, studied resistance culture. He knows enslaved Africans survived not just through physical endurance, but through consciousness. Through the passing down of warning systems, cultural memory, spiritual grounding, and political awareness. Kevin Roberts knows that oppressed people die when they become disconnected from history. And now he leads a movement trying to erase that history. Think about how cold that is. The right wing took a sacred survival term born out of black struggle and deliberately poisoned it in the public imagination. They stuffed woke with caricatures, panic, culture war nonsense, and manufactured outrage until millions of Americans hear the word and no longer think awareness, they think enemy. That was intentional. Because an aware population is harder to manipulate. Historically grounded people are harder to conquer. People who understand systems are harder to deceive. So what do authoritarian movements always attack first? Education, history, books, language, critical thought, and collective memory. They attack the very tools people use to recognize oppression while it's happening. That's why attacks on DEI, black studies, critical race theory, and historical truth are not random policy disagreements. They are attempts to blind people socially and politically. If you can disconnect people from the truth of how power historically operated, you could make them repeat the cycle while calling it patriotism. And that is where the real betrayal is. Not disagreement, not ideology, betrayal. Because if you truly studied the survival of black people under oppression, then you understand exactly why awareness matters. You understand exactly why stay woke existed. And if you then weaponize that understanding against the public for political power, you are not merely dishonest. You are participating in psychological disarmament of a people, and that's dangerous. And history has seen that kind of person before. The intellectual who studies suffering not to end it, but to better manage resistance to it. That's why we must remain exactly what they fear most. Aware, historically grounded, politically conscious, difficult to manipulate. Stay woke. This is the open eye. WHGE 95.3 FM. All right. I've seen this, and I've seen him a few times. Angry white dude. I never called his name. But boy, he gets something said. I'm going to quote him here, and I got to clean it up for radio. Then when you hear me say something like freaking or effing, know that he was bringing it. And I quote, "I am so freaking tired of white men cosplaying the apocalypse. The only effing reason why we needed the goddamn Voting Rights Act in the first place is because of white men. I don't care that you don't effing see the value in it. Neither did your great-grandfather. And that's the effing reason we have it. It got passed in the effing 60s. I'm tired of pretending that the MFers responsible for us needing it aren't still alive. Alive, and you call them grandma and grandpa. So no, white boy, I don't care what the F you think about the goddamn Voting Rights Act. I don't care what any white person thinks about it at all. Because the only reason we needed any of this crap is because white people had to be told in writing not to be awful. That's the part you don't like. But that's what laws are. Laws are society saying, don't be a piece of shit. It's very weird that we have so many effing laws surrounding race. But the reason is simple. White men would not be better. They would not do better. It doesn't effing matter what year it is. In the year of our Lord 2026, we are still debating the merits of black people voting because too many of you are not different from your effing ancestors. That's from the angry white dude. He ain't pulling no punches either. And here's something else this country refuses to confront honestly. America treats racism like it's a weather pattern. Like it just happened. Like segregation floated down from the sky with the rain. Like lynching was some mysterious force of nature. Like voter suppression just accidentally appeared in southern legislatures. No, these were choices. Human choices, policy choices, white power choices. And every time this country has had to pass a civil rights law, a voting rights law, a fair housing law, an anti-lynching law, which it took 100 goddamn years to pass, an integration order, or a constitutional amendment protecting black citizenship, it was because white America collectively had already demonstrated that without legal restraint, it would deny black people basic humanity. That's the uncomfortable truth buried underneath every one of these debates. People talk about the Voting Rights Act like it was charity. It wasn't charity. It was federal enforcement against generations of racial terrorism. You don't need a Voting Rights Act unless somebody is actively trying to stop people from voting. You don't need federal marshals escorting children in the schools unless mobs are screaming at children outside school doors. You don't need the civil rights movement unless the system itself is diseased. And what frustrates so many people today is this attempt to pretend the disease disappeared while the symptoms are still standing right in front of us. Because every few years, America gets shocked that voter rolls get purged. Polling places disappear from black neighborhoods. Districts get carved up like butchered meat. History gets banned from classrooms, and diversity itself gets treated like a threat to civilization. And y'all shocked. As if this country don't spend most of its existence openly constructing a racial hierarchy. As if the same bloodlines, same institutions, same ideologies, same political machinery didn't survive into the present day. That's why these conversations become so explosive, because one side is talking about opinions, while the other side is talking about survival and historical memory. Black Americans remember that our right to vote was not secured by goodwill. It was secured by protests, dogs, fire hoses, bombings, beatings, prison cells, assassinations, and graves. People died for that right. So when somebody casually says, maybe we don't need these protections anymore, what black people hear is, we want the restraints removed. And history tells us exactly what happens when those restraints disappear. That's the part America keeps trying to skip over. You cannot spend centuries proving why protections were necessary and then get offended when people refuse to trust your sorry ass. That ain't paranoia. That's pattern recognition. And if this country truly wants to move forward, to stop asking black people to forget history while actively recreating it. Because people that listen to the open eye see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. This is the open eye. Patrice Gibbs. Man, time flies. Right. WHGE 95.3 FM. It's from Brother Keith Boykin. The ink is barely dried on last week's Supreme Court decision gutting the Voting Rights Act, and Republicans are already racing to disenfranchise black voters. Damn. In Louisiana, the state's Republican governor, Jeff Landry, declared a state of emergency, suspended the congressional primary election on Saturday, and signed a law eliminating a local position in New Orleans. Calvin Duncan, a newly elected black official who won with 68% of the vote, 68%, had to get a federal court order on Sunday so he could take office. In Alabama, Republican Governor Kay Ivey called a special session of the legislature to meet today to redraw the state's maps with the goal of eliminating districts represented by 2 black members of Congress, Terry Sewell of Birmingham and Shamari Figures of Mobile. In Tennessee, Republican Governor Bill Lee has called for a special session to meet tomorrow to redraw the state's map to eliminate a majority-minority district in Memphis, where State Representative Justin Pearson of Tennessee is running for Congress. In Florida, 1 hour after last week's Supreme Court decision, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis got the State House to approve a new map, even though an aide to DeSantis admitted that the goal was to blow up the majority black district in South Florida. Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida. 4 states in 1 week. 1 week. Okay? And they ain't hiding it. They just straight up in your face telling you there's going to be no black representation. All right? Now, here's the deeper issue that America keeps pretending not to understand. Every generation of black America has had to fight the same goddamn battle wearing a different uniform. First it was slavery, then black codes, then convict leasing, then poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, then racial terror lynchings, redlining, then mass incarceration. Now it's gerrymandering, voter suppression laws, polling places closures, election takeovers, and court decisions dressed up in constitutional language. Nobody spends that much energy trying to suppress powerless people. That's the real story. The fight over voting rights has never been about fraud. It's always been about fear. Fear of demographic change, fear of shared power, fear of accountability, fear of losing control over the narrative of America itself. If voting were meaningless, they wouldn't work this hard to stop people from doing it. For those of you that say voting don't matter, wake up. WHGE 95.3 FM. This is The Open Eye. Stephen Goebbels Miller, bald-head bastard. And sick son of a bitch. He hates it that white people are protesting because he expected people of color to be doing it. And not people of color. You know, I don't like that POC crap because it don't always include us. Ain't that right, Officer Ashley Gonzalez? Yeah. Because he expected black people to be out there protesting. White people, including the elder hippies, are stepping up the resistance because they understand the danger that black people will face in massive protests. We all know what the MAGA government would do if thousands of black people took to the streets to peacefully protest. Miller wants to fight them. But the old white hippies are getting in his way. There's a reason the images coming out of these protests are rattling people like Stephen Miller and the machinery behind this MAGA movement. Because this was not the script they expected. They expected the faces in the streets to be black, brown, immigrant, Muslim, Palestinian. Young activists from communities they've already spent years demonizing and criminalizing. They expected protests they could instantly frame as threats, as riots, as invasions, as terror sympathizers. They expected confrontation. They expected fear. They expected a justification for escalation. And then something happened they didn't fully prepare for. Large numbers of white Americans, including the older white Americans, the old anti-war crowd, the elder hippies, retired teachers, veterans, church people, suburban grandparents, they started showing up. And that changes the optics. That changes the politics. That changes the calculation. Because America has a long, ugly history of reacting differently depending on who is protesting. And we all know it. If thousands of angry black protesters surrounded government buildings carrying signs about state violence, there will already be calls for law and order. National Guard deployments, mass arrests, surveillance expansion, and breathless cable news coverage talking about urban unrest. If immigrant communities flooded the streets in them same numbers, MAGA media would be screaming about insurrection before the first chant even echoed off a wall. But older white Americans standing in the street, gray-haired people in sandals and denim jackets, Vietnam-era protesters, college professors, retired union workers. Oh, that complicates the narrative they've been selling. Yeah. Because now the country sees something dangerous for authoritarian movements, cross-racial solidarity. And authoritarian politics survive by isolation. See, you keep white workers afraid of black workers. You keep black Americans suspicious of immigrants. You keep Latinos disconnected from Asians. Keep everybody fragmented, angry, suspicious, and fighting sideways instead of upward. That's the formula. That's always been the formula. And when ordinary white Americans begin looking at immigrant raids, attacks on protest rights, book bans, political intimidation, mass surveillance, attacks on universities, and open flirtations with authoritarianism, and say, no, oh no, we've been here before. That becomes harder to contain, especially when some of those older protesters remember the civil rights era. They remember COINTELPRO. They remember Kent State, Birmingham. They remember what happens when governments start labeling dissent itself as the enemy. And let's be honest, some of these elder white protesters understand something else too. They know black communities will likely absorb the harshest violence first. Heard them say so. They know history. They know who gets beaten first. They know who gets arrested first. They know who gets surveilled first. They know who gets called thugs. Who gets disappeared into the system first. So some are stepping into the line deliberately, not as saviors, not as heroes, but as witnesses, as buffers, as people saying, if the government wants to crush peaceful dissent, we'll have to do it in front of everybody. That matters. Because one thing history teaches over and over again is this: authoritarian movements become truly dangerous when the majority convinces itself repression only happens to those people. But the moment broad coalitions begin forming, the entire strategy of division starts cracking. And that's what frightens people like Miller the most. Yeah, not what you expected, is it? Just sorry bastard. WHGE 95.3 FM, the Open Eye. WHGE 94. Try that again. WHGE 95.3 FM. This is the Open Eye. Forgot to turn my mic on. Don't want to thank Sister Sherry for this. White people have long claimed that black people are the most violent people in the history of this country. But if that's true, which it definitely is not, then why isn't there any recordings of black people gathering in the thousands to watch a white person being lynched? That kind of circus only happened with white people who never saw black people as anything other than property, even long after slavery ended. For example, on August 14th, 1936, an estimated crowd of 15,000 to 20,000 people gathered in Owensboro, Kentucky, to witness the public hanging of Rainey Bethia, a 26-year-old black man. This event is documented as the last legal public execution in the United States. The victim in the crime. Bethia was convicted of the rape and murder of Leshia Edwards, a 70-year-old white woman. The hanging drew a massive crowd from across the country, with many spectators driving to Owensboro to witness the event. Media reports described the atmosphere as a carnival or circus, with vendors selling items to the crowd. The execution was botched, with the professional hangman appearing intoxicated, requiring a deputy to eventually trigger the mechanism. The circus. The aftermath was the national shame and media circus surrounding the event prompted Kentucky legislatures that end public executions in 1938. What America has always done is accuse black people of being what white supremacy itself has historically been: violence, savage violence, industrial violence, spectacle violence, structural violence. Because there's a difference between violence born out of oppression and violence institutionalized as entertainment. America has centuries of evidence showing miles of white citizens gathering to celebrate Black Death like it was a county fair. Entire families brought their children to the lynchings. Can you imagine taking your child to watch somebody killed? Vendors sold food. People posed for photographs beneath hanging bodies. Postcards were made from corpses. Human beings were burned alive while crowds smiled into the camera. And yes, those Black people that were burned alive, those burned bodies were cut up for souvenirs, and meals. If Black people were truly the bloodthirsty monsters this country invented, in its racist imagination, history would show massive Black crowds gathering to torture and publicly execute white people for sport. Where's the photographs? Where's the goddamn postcards? Where are the carnival lynchings attended by 15,000 Black spectators cheering while white bodies swung from the trees? They don't exist. Because the lie was never about Black behavior. The lie was about justifying white behavior. In the 1936 execution of Rainey Bethia, exposes something ugly that America still refuses to confront. 15,000 to 20,000 people gathered in Owensboro, Kentucky to watch a Black man die. Think about that. Not 5 people, not 50, not a courtroom full of witnesses, a small city's worth of human beings gathered before dawn to watch a public execution. Newspapers described it as a carnival atmosphere. Vendors sold souvenirs and refreshments. People traveled across state lines for the event. Families came like they were attending a parade. It had a damn thing to do with justice. Even after slavery ended, Black people were still treated as public property. Black suffering was still considered consumable. Black death was still theater. That's why the constant attempt to portray Black anger as uniquely dangerous is so dishonest. America survived centuries of white mob violence, slavery, lynching, massacres, bombings, race riots, church burnings, public executions, and state-sanctioned terror. But somehow the descendants of the victims are the ones endlessly lectured about violence. History speaks for itself. When Black people demanded freedom, they marched. When white supremacists resisted equality, they gathered crowds to watch bodies swing. That distinction matters. And America hasn't fully reckoned with it. And never will. It's called projection. Projecting your bad behavior on the very people you sought to destroy. Damn. This is Nova 9. WHGE 95.3 FM. And this next quote is from Lady Creole. And I picked it because I say, like, it was like she read my mind. Feeling the same way. Lady Creole said, you know what I hate about knowing, understanding, and having taught American history? You notice the pattern of things that are coming. So far, the Republican Party at state levels and former Confederate states and at the federal level controls 3 branches of government, right? They have attacked 2 of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. As the 14th Amendment, when it impacts our citizenship as black people and other people of color. And then it impacts the right to vote, which started with black people and later expanded to other people of color as a byproduct. So that leaves 1 left in order to be considered a full human being in this country as a black person. Because it wasn't granted to us by the U.S. Constitution. Remember, the Founding Fathers owned slaves at the time they were signing the U.S. Constitution. It took an amendment to decide that we were not considered property. We don't have God-given rights in this country. We have amendments to the Constitution. We're going back to the 13th Amendment, which has a stipulation that says you are not considered property unless you are incarcerated. Then you are considered property. You are considered a citizen through the 14th Amendment, which grants you the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, because if you can't vote, you're not a citizen. You can't vote if you're not a citizen. And they've already attacked who is considered a citizen versus who is not considered a citizen. Now they're coming after who can actually vote, which leaves us with who they deem to be free individual in this country. Our freedom is next. That's not fear-mongering. That's paying attention to American history and American government the way it was written, the way they have laid it out. The Republican Party and white nationalists understand what it means for black people to be considered anything more than property in this country. The only thing that separated us from being considered a free individual versus an enslaved person in this country was our skin color. That was it. That was it. So when people say stupid crap like, there was slavery everywhere, in America, the only thing that separated us from everybody else was our skin color. And the 13th Amendment made it so that you cannot own people in this country. And the people that were owned in this country were black people. Mark my words. The 13th Amendment is next. And that's from Lady Creole. Now here's the part people don't want to confront. American history is not random. It moves in cycles. Every single time black Americans make measurable gains in citizenship, education, voting power, land ownership, political representation, or economic independence, there's a coordinated backlash designed to reduce those gains. Reconstruction gave black people citizenship. Then came black codes, convict leasing, and lynching. Black communities built economic power. Then came massacres in places like Tulsa, Rosewood, and Wilmington. The civil rights movement forced open the ballot box. Then came voter suppression wrapped in law and order language. And today, the language has changed, but the pattern hasn't. They attack diversity programs. They attack black history. They attack voting access. They attack affirmative action. They attack birthright citizenship. They attack protests, and they attack books. They attack any framework that acknowledges racism as structural instead of accidental. Why? Because citizenship is power. Voting is power. Education is power. Historical memory is power. And if you can redefine who counts as a real American, then you can redefine who deserves rights. See, that's the game. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, were not gifts. They were emergency repairs made after slavery nearly destroyed the nation. Those amendments were designed specifically because America, as originally written, did not protect black people. That's historical fact. The Constitution had to be amended because black people were excluded from the definition of full humanity under law. And here's the cold truth. There are still forces in this country deeply uncomfortable with the idea of black citizenship being permanent, equal, and protected. And this discomfort shows up every time black political participation increases. And you can hear it in the language. Real Americans, take our country back. States' rights. Election integrity. Law and order. Anti-woke. Different century, same music. Now, whether someone agrees with every conclusion in Lady Creole's statement or not, the underlying warning about historical patterns is not something serious people should dismiss casually. Because history teaches one thing very clearly. Rights that are not defended become rights that are restricted. And black Americans know this country differently than many others do. Because our freedom here was never assumed. It had to be fought for, legislated for, marched for, bled for, and buried for. That's why some people hear political rhetoric as normal politics, while others hear echoes. Because some of us know exactly what this country sounds like when it starts moving backward. And that, family, is the part that should keep America awake at night. Now that's where, because they intend to enslave us. Remember what I tell you. What Nellie Fuller teaches us. White supremacy has a plan for black people. They will exploit us. If they can't exploit us, they will enslave us. If they can't enslave us, they'll kill us. Never let them forget we are our ancestors' dream. Just open eye. WHGE 95.3 FM. You know, most open eye listeners, especially those online, you know, I close the show with the statement global African supremacy. I push that. Pan-African. I believe in that. And so I'm pissed off. I'm pissed at you, South African. I damn sure am. What pisses me off is watching Africans be manipulated into attacking other Africans over borders that were never ours to begin with. Borders drawn in European conference rooms by colonizers who carved up Africa like meat on a table. And now, generations later, Africans are spilling African blood, defending colonial lies, while the economic structure built by colonialism remains standing. Hell's wrong with y'all? A brother crosses a border trying to escape poverty, instability, unemployment, or desperation, and instead of asking who created those conditions, too many people attack the brothers standing next to them in the same struggle. The immigrant becomes the enemy, while the corporations, the old colonial power structures, the mining interests, the banks, and the concentrated wealth remain untouched. That's the real tragedy. And yes, I respect Nelson Mandela. Any serious person must respect the sacrifice. 27 years behind bars. 27 years stolen from a man's life in the fight against apartheid. That level of sacrifice deserves honor. But respect does not mean silence. Because political liberation without economic liberation leaves the foundation of oppression intact. The flag changed, the government changed, the language of power changed, but too much of the wealth, land, industry, and economic control remained in the same hands. The minds remained controlled. The economic hierarchy remained. The townships remained. The inequality remained. And when people remain economically trapped, anger gets directed sideways instead of upward. So now the oppressed fight the oppressed, while the beneficiaries of the old system watch comfortably from behind gates, boardrooms, and investment portfolios. That was an unfinished revolution. Forgiveness without restructuring becomes surrender. Reconciliation without redistribution becomes symbolism. You can't heal a nation economically built on theft without confronting the theft itself. Because if the masses are still landless, still poor, still economically dependent, still fighting each other for scraps decades later, then freedom becomes a ceremony instead of a transformation. The colonizers' greatest victory was never taking the land. It wasn't just taking the land. It was convincing Africans to see each other as enemies while leaving the economic machinery of exploitation intact. Until Africans across the continent begin to see beyond colonial borders and recognize the common struggle, the system that extracted Africa's wealth for centuries will continue to survive, using Africans against Africans to protect itself. And for those who ask, who are you, Black American, to criticize South Africa? Well, the answer to that question is simple. That's an easy answer. I had the right because your struggle and my struggle was never separate. You think the Atlantic Ocean erased our kinship? You think slavery disconnected us from Africa instead of proving how connected we are? My ancestors did not arrive in America as immigrants. They arrived as stolen Africans, prisoners of war. The same European powers that colonized South Africa financed, justified, and built a system that enslaved black people right here in America. The same ideology that created apartheid created Jim Crow. The same racial hierarchy that put passes on black South Africans put chains on black Americans. So don't tell me Africa is none of my business. Africa's always been my business. When apartheid existed, black people right here in America marched, protested, organized boycotts, raised awareness, and demanded sanctions against the apartheid government. Black artists refused to perform there. Black activists went to jail protesting South African apartheid. African Americans stood with South Africans because we understood that white supremacy was not local. It's global. So if I had the right to stand with you in your struggle, then I have the right to speak when I see us failing each other. And understand something else. Criticism is not hatred. Indifference is hatred. I'm criticizing because I give a damn. I'm criticizing because I see Africans fighting Africans over conditions created by colonialism while multinational corporations continue extracting African wealth. I'm criticizing because I expected more from a people who defeated apartheid. I'm criticizing because I know what divide and conquer looks like. I live inside one of its greatest surviving laboratories, America. Black Americans know exactly how systems manipulate poor people into blaming each other while power escapes accountability. We watched white supremacy redraw itself for generations. We watched economic inequality get disguised as cultural conflict. We watch politicians weaponize fear between communities while wealth consolidates upward. So when I see Africans turning on fellow Africans instead of confronting the economic structure still choking the continent, I recognize the playbook immediately. And let's stop pretending colonial borders are sacred. They were drawn by Europeans who barely understood or respected the people living there and who was uncivilized. Those borders were not created to unite Africans. They were created to control Africans. So no, I will not be silent because I'm African American. I'm speaking precisely because I am an African in America. Because history tied our struggles together long before any of us were born. This is Open Eye. WHGE 95.3 FM. All right, y'all. I gotta get ready to get out of here. All right. Hey, brother Mishba, I see you. As we close out today's broadcast, remember this. The greatest weapon ever used against African people was not chains, not whips, not prison, not even laws. It was disconnection, Disconnection from history, from land, from culture, from memory, and from ourselves. Because the people who know who they are become very difficult to manipulate. That's why history is attacked. That's why books are banned. That's why certain truths make people uncomfortable. Because truth restores memory, and memory restores power. And when black people begin reconnecting the dots between slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, economic exploitation, media propaganda, voter suppression, and modern political extremism, the illusion starts collapsing. Suddenly you realize these are not isolated incidents. They are chapters in the same story. And here's the good news. Every generation produces people who refuse to surrender. People who refuse to become spiritually colonized. People who refuse to mistake proximity to power for liberation. People who refuse to trade dignity for acceptance. And whether the world understands them or not, they continue to work quietly, relentlessly, unapologetically. So today, protect your mind, protect your history, protect your community, protect your humanity. Study deeper, think sharper, move wiser. Because the future belongs to people who can recognize truth in an age of manufactured confusion. And remember, an open eye can never again comfortably live in darkness. I hope you learned something today, because I learned something before I got here. And as we always tell you, destiny determines who enters your life, and you decide who stays. Therefore, value those who value you, and don't treat those as a priority who treat you as an option. This has been The Open Eye on WHGE 95.3 FM. I'm your host, Patrice Gibbs. Thanks for joining us. Peace. All right. Yeah, I'm a person of optimism. So I still hold on to the faith that global African supremacy is inevitable, because the world was a much better place when the black man ruled. I'm Patrice Gibbs. Peace and love.